Good afternoon, everyone. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'll be really brief in my comments. While this morning's talks focused on promising principles from the lab, where researchers have the luxury of running controlled lab settings, randomly assigning participants, and manipulating variables at will, there's a bigger challenge, I think, in translating this type of research to the real world, into the classroom. And I'm really excited to hear the talks this afternoon because that's what these researchers are trying to do. Our first speaker for this afternoon is Melanie Wiseheart, who is Associate Professor at York University. Melanie has done some exceptional work on spacing, and she's done some of this work with Hal Pashler. And what we're going to hear about today is how this work is now extended into an actual classroom. So please join me in welcoming Melanie Wiseheart.
I'm going to start off the talk with a little secret. My secret that I actually do tell my undergrads, thankfully fourth-year undergrads, so they don't realize this early in their career. Massing or cramming for an exam actually works really well, and in many cases, cramming for an exam is better than spacing. And so I want you to take that little message right there and think about this and what implications it has for you as a teacher. So what do you need to do with your course that might help you to design the course in a way that will actually maximize long-term retention? This is assuming that you as a teacher actually cares about long-term retention. So what can you do to make long-term retention the priority of what happens in the course? Because really it's up to you as the teachers to make that difference. Okay. This slide looks remarkably familiar to something Catherine just showed this morning, so I guess you get spaced learning with it. This is a study done in 1923, and this is forgetting in an actual first-year psychology course. You can see here that they've lost, what is this, like 2/3 of their retention? Just, 8 weeks, just 2 months after the course was taken, they've lost 2/3 of what they had initially. So this is why we need principles and we need things that come from the lab in order to help boost retention and boost classroom performance. Importantly, it is useful, and details of the study don't matter. What the point of this is that we can actually change forgetting rate. Forgetting is not a finite thing. We actually can reduce the rate of forgetting, which is really important. So we need to think about, as educational psychologists, what principles we could use to actually reduce forgetting. The concept that I've been working with for a little while now, it's called the spacing effect. And the idea is that you have, in a typical paradigm, this is a typical lab-based paradigm, so I'm going to start out with a little bit of lab stuff. You have 2 study episodes. It's the minimum number that you can have in a spacing study. And those study episodes are either close together or they're farther apart. So there's some kind of gap between the study episodes. And that's either masked or spaced. And then we have a final test. So we actually care about what it is you're measuring at that final test. And in spacing effect studies, we have 2 variables, one of which we typically manipulate, and one of which is typically, although I'll show you an exception, one of which is typically not manipulated. So the inter-study interval, you'll have more or less time between the study episodes. And typically the retention interval is fixed at 1 value. So you're looking at the effect of the difference in inter-study interval on retention after a fixed time period, notably after the second study episode. So you have the same amount of forgetting taking place after that second episode. I started doing this work in, as Joe said, in Hal Pashler's lab somewhere around 2002. And one of the first things that I did was review the literature. So I did a huge meta-analysis that's gotten way more citations than I can count. Read the entire literature. At one point, Hal had this really humiliating slide of me with a stack of papers about that high, because I read all of that stuff. So out of that entire giant stack of papers, just imagine this, I located only about, what is this, 4 papers that had properly conducted experiments that had a fixed retention interval, that's one of the keys, a fixed retention interval, and had manipulation with at least 2 different interstudy intervals, and that looked at long-term retention. So we're talking about retention in long-term, 1 day or more retention. So we're not even talking about educationally relevant, we're just talking about 1 day longer retention. So that kind of surprised me, because I did read something like 700 articles with a combination of well over 1,000 experiments. To only have 6 experiments that are confound-free and that look at long-term retention. This isn't even classroom work. This is how much at the infancy classroom-based spacing effect research really is. Because this was 2002, and I think what is the most recent study in there is like 1980 or something. So the importance of making changes and looking at educational psychology as a tool for helping teachers to teach better. The general conclusion from the studies is that performance is pretty bad whenever you mass performance. So whenever the interstudy interval is 0 days. Performance is better whenever the interstudy interval is a day. And at least in the initial literature, performance looked like it didn't really drop off very much after that 1 day interstudy interval. So having a longer gap didn't seem to hurt. But that would be really nice if it were true. Because then we could say to teachers, oh, just give a 1 day gap. It doesn't matter if it's longer, as long as it's at least a day. It's perfect. You've boosted the retention as much as you can. But as you'll see, we actually wanted to test that assumption, because we can't really base it on these 4 studies. We need to actually demonstrate whether that's true. So the first study that we did was in the lab. We used a retention interval of 10 days, and we used a range of interstudy intervals from 0 days to 14 days. And that basically meant it's similar to what the literature has done. So the literature had 1 to 7 days for the retention interval. We chose 10. But given the number of interstudy intervals, we also can look at the curve. So what did we do? I don't know if Catherine got the Swahili from me or what happened, but the little story I'll give you the tiny backstory behind the Swahili is we asked one of the faculty in the linguistics department what language would not be known by students at UCSD and would actually be pronounceable by people who speak English as a first language. And he recommended Swahili, and now apparently all the literature is going to Swahili, and it's fine. No one at UCSD knew Swahili. Go to another country, it might be different. So we are teaching a bunch of information, and we use tests with feedback. That's important. You're always giving feedback, and you keep presenting a set of items over and over and over again in random order until everybody's able to actually remember all the items. That's session 1. Then we have them relearn the items. One of the big confounds that was in the literature, which actually Catherine's introducing as a feature in one of her studies, is having people go through a fixed number of relearning trials. So they went through and relearned the items 2 times. Because otherwise you have a confound and you don't know whether it's the amount of relearning that they had or whether it's the spacing. And then we had a final test session. So we give them a set of items, and this time we do not give them feedback. And what we found basically is a replication of the literature. So performance is really bad with masked studies, so 0 day interstudy interval. It's good at 1 day. And then there's a little bit of drop off, but not too much if you have a longer interstudy interval. So it seems so far that maybe this 1 day interstudy interval idea is really good. But as I said, we want to actually test this before we make claims because it has huge implications for what teachers should do. So we chose a retention interval for the next study of 6 months. 6 months is actually educationally relevant. So what you teach towards the beginning of the year, you might actually remember it towards the end of the year. Or as Catherine was saying, over summer. So you have a 4-month summer vacation. Well, this is 6 months, but it's still the equivalent of a summer vacation plus a bit. We have a range of different interstudy intervals. And we taught 2 different kinds of information. How many people here, raise your hand if you've heard of snow golf before you see this slide? Oh my gosh, there's actually 2 hands. I thought when I moved to Canada from San Diego that all of a sudden I was going to move to this land where everyone played snow golf. But apparently Canada's not the land of folks. Okay. So we taught people obscure facts, and we taught people to place names with pictures. So this particular picture happens to be one that's a little magnified image of a coccolith, which don't ask me what that is because I'm not a geologist, but it's some kind of geology thing. So we actually have kind of 2 studies in one. And in this particular one, you see at the very top, the initial study was Swahili English, and that shows that the 1-day interstudy interval is optimal. And here, it's quite obvious with both picture-based stimuli and verbal stimuli that this 1-day interstudy interval is not always the best. So we said, okay, we have this interstudy interval that is about a month is optimal for 6 months. So then we started thinking, maybe it's just a ratio. And I think in one of my papers, Hal actually put in the sentence, the 10% ratio, blah, 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 which we subsequently found, if you look at the 2009 paper, we subsequently found this 10% ratio is a really terrible idea, so do not take that home. But that was the initial idea, and so we wanted to test things around this 10% ratio. And we wanted to use, because I am very masochistic, we wanted to use a really, really, really long retention interval, not the bar kind of 12-year thing. That was insane. But we chose up to a year. So here, I said we normally don't manipulate retention interval, but in this particular case, we wanted to be able to look within a set of items, within a set of material, because obviously Swahili is not the same as fact learning. Within a set of material, if we vary the retention interval and we vary the interstudy interval, what happens? And the only way that we could possibly do this experiment was online. So we did one of the earliest online experiments and had fun publishing that one because at that point people didn't actually trust online data. Now I think it's a little more accepted. But we got somewhere on the order of 4,000 subjects. I forget, it was a lot. And we had a combination, I think there were 26 combinations of interstudy interval and retention interval. So it's somewhere around 30 people per condition. So it may sound like 4,000 is a lot, but it's not when you have 26 experimental conditions. And we just chose to use the facts because we had the stimuli. An undergrad at UCSD did all this work, and it was like, they came up with this list of about 150 facts that we now just draw from. It's nice to have students. All of you undergrads, thank you. So what about very long-term retention? What we see here is that, yes, it is the case that the optimal interstudy interval does get longer as the retention interval gets longer. So it's clear that there's not one fixed ideal ISI. I'm sorry. I wish that I could just say to teachers, 1 day is perfect, but it's not. You really need, as a teacher, to consider when it is that your students are going to have to recall this information. And if you care about over summer in particular, then you do one thing. The nice bit about these data, you can see that the curve does tend to have sort of a not so sharp inflection point. So you can get away with having a range that will be reasonably good for a long range of retention intervals. And I'm constantly asked by teachers, what should I use? And I say, well, somewhere on the order of 2 to 4 weeks is probably a good interstudy interval for a wide range of retention intervals that you'd actually care about. It may not be optimal for any of them, but it'll be really strong for a lot of them. So that's sort of my take-home recommendation before you've even done the classroom studies. The other interesting thing you can see here that we replicate in a lot of our studies is that the putting material at an optimal ISI matters a whole lot more as the retention interval gets longer. And part of that's being closer to baseline, but it's important. If you really care about long-term retention, choosing that inter-study interval really does matter. You can see in this bottom line that you're basically doubling performance by choosing a good inter-study interval versus a bad one. And if you choose what would be a quote-unquote bad inter-study interval for this 1 week retention interval, which you might do if you're trying to maximize performance on that exam next week, okay, so it's going to hurt you a bit. But the gain that you get down here in terms of long-term retention is huge. And you only get this tiny, like 10% drop by choosing a bad inter-study interval for the 7 days. In return, you get this huge gain. So really think about the implications of this. And take a look at the 2008 Psych Science paper if you don't feel like making notes. So classrooms. Classrooms are inherently different beasts than the lab. And by now I've done enough classroom studies to at least have some kind of grasp, not the Mark McDaniel grasp, but some kind of grasp on the challenges that go on in classrooms. I'm just going to throw up a few things that are different about classrooms. I'm sure you can come up with many, many, many more. Things like the cluttered environment, so you can see all this stuff that's all around the room. I remember I had a Spanish teacher once who decided that it was really smart to put photos and pictures and artwork all over her wall, and you couldn't even see any white space on the wall. It was so cluttered. That's really, really challenging in terms of maintaining attention on the content. Not all learning is rote memory. That's huge. How many of you, as students in psychology, focused more than anything on memorizing a bunch of random stuff that you would never have to know in the future? What are you doing here, McMaster? This is not typical of York. York's like so much memorization. So not all learning is rote memory. People miss classes. That messes up the implementation. We got grant reviews back and they said, you need to use item response theory because we know there's going to be missing cells and it handles those missing cells really well. And teachers are not perfect. We may have a lot of control over things in the lab, but teachers are going to make mistakes. They're going to present something wrong. They're going to, anything can happen. And so we need to look at the ability of the spacing effect to survive all of these sources of noise. All these sources of noise are going to tend to reduce the magnitude of what you actually observe in the classroom. So we saw doubling in the lab, but are we going to see doubling in the classroom, or is it going to shrink and shrink and shrink from all these sources of noise? And is it going to disappear? Sure hope not. Before I go into the 5th grade vocabulary, one of the classroom challenges, I'm saying this in front of professors, so maybe this, okay, I have tenure. We went into 2 different classrooms. We went into a psychology classroom and a classroom in, I can't even remember what it was at this point. It was like English or something, some other kind of discipline. And we made this, I don't know, we made an assumption, and that's always a bad idea in science. Our assumption was that students read the textbook and then come to class and they actually learn something from what the professor says. that was an assumption that I had an MA student. Oh, I feel so sorry for her. Unpublishable data, because it turns out, from her 2 years of master's thesis data collection, it turns out that the students actually learned almost nothing in lectures. So she had gone in and had all of these things where people taught content and content and content and content, and then she gave these beautiful online tests. It was all perfect, except for the fact that their initial learning performance was somewhere near like 10 or 20%. So we couldn't actually use the data or test anything because the lecture was a really bad way to learn. And I guess we see this some with Catherine studying with all the like tutorials, and you're going into intro psych and you're doing something that Maybe we should just replace teachers with that because apparently it's working way better than teachers are. I didn't say that because people always are afraid we're going to replace teachers with robots. Okay, recover myself. So we did 5th grade vocabulary, rote memorization. We mimicked kind of a lab-based thing, but I had an undergrad who also was going for a teaching degree. She actually presented all the material. So she was a teacher candidate, doing things in a way that would make sense in the classroom, blah, blah, blah. All the correct counterbalancing, whatnot. We had 2 different interstudy intervals. Remember, this is an undergrad honors thesis. And we had a retention interval of 5 weeks. So we basically measured what they could remember over Christmas break. She was teaching them GRE vocabulary words, which obviously 5th graders do not know GRE vocab, so it was novel material. A bunch of manipulations that didn't work out. That's always the case in science. And what we found is that this 1 week retention interval, or the 1 week interstudy interval versus the massing, actually did more than double, almost triple their retention from pre-Christmas break to post-Christmas break. So this is really great. Like, this is a real classroom. We had missed classes. We had all those sources of noise. It was actually at the very beginning of day during their bell work. I don't know, I didn't go to Canadian schools, but apparently there's this thing called bell work at the beginning for like 20 minutes to get settled because you've just been talking to your friends and you have to get in the mood to be in class. So it wasn't even an ideal time of day. And so we still get the spacing effect to survive. Some of my colleagues at UCSD went into a classroom with disadvantaged youth, 8th graders in San Diego. So these were people who were at a special school for people who really wanted to make their way in life, but they came from very low SES backgrounds, so they had a lot of challenges facing them. They took the content from a US history course that they were taking. They went to all the lectures or all the classes that the teacher was teaching, and like what Catherine did, they took out some questions of the content that the teacher actually presented in class, and they gave a quiz afterward with feedback, our traditional test and feedback kind of thing. And they did that either 1 week after the end of their final exam or at the end of summer, so 16 weeks later. And then we tested their retention 9 months after they did the review session. And it wasn't, it's like 30 items or something out of their U.S. history class. So they learned all this stuff in the normal way you would always learn U.S. history. And then they plopped in this extra little quiz. So things like that. So, what they found is that, or we, I guess, because I actually did help design this, is that retention is improved for 16 weeks versus 1 week. So we're getting like a third improvement at this 9 months later retention interval. And the 1 week versus 16 weeks is a much harder manipulation than what we saw in the 5th grade classroom. Because like you saw in the initial slides, the biggest bump from spacing is 0 versus anything that's not 0. So massing is always worse than any amount of spacing. So I think there was a question, I don't see the face, but there was a question for Catherine earlier, like how much should we space? And I would say a minimum of 1 day. That's sort of the minimum, because that's where the big benefit is between 0 and 1. Here between 1 and 16, it's a little bit harder to find because we've lost the ability to see on the graph the initial massing learning. Okay. Now, where I'm going in the future. Critical thinking, because I think it's important that we not just study rote memorization of facts. That gets a little bit old. It's an important part of education, but not all of education. So, and most of the studies have been done way down at the bottom of that triangle in the knowledge, just rote memory level. Back there in the background, you can see Tina Weston, one of my grad students, who spent months and months and months developing the best weather lecture you've ever seen. It's an excellent way to actually learn, and we demonstrate this through her great learning. And this is a slide from a study I did with Faria way back in the back there on laptop distraction, but it's the same lecture that she used. Just plugging little Faria studies, go read her stuff. It's great. Sexiest article we've ever published and ever will. We had, in the mock classroom study, 1 and 8 day ISIs and a 5-week retention interval. And we had 2 types of questions. We had fact questions and we had applied questions. So the applied question, they could not just memorize, they had to take a formula and apply it somewhere else. There was a bit of extra stuff. And I like Catherine's little thing where she was going, like, here's the facts, they're rote memorizing, and then we have applied tests in the course. And here we're actually working on spacing during all the sessions. They're working on applying problems. What we see is the spacing effect does hold up. We get a spacing effect for not just rote memory, but also for applied questions. This should be published any day now because it's in the final minor revision stage and about to be accepted. So you should be on the lookout for this. You'll actually be able to cite it. Where am I going in the future? Critical thinking. I've been submitting grants to Institute of Education Sciences on looking at critical thinking in the classroom in grade 6, 7, like middle school classrooms, looking at how critical thinking affects spacing. We have a critical thinking expert. We're using Innes's framework because we were told by IES that Bloom's is great for doing test design, but we're actually going in and using a much more robust, psychologically driven, theoretically motivated critical thinking framework, collaborating with someone at McMaster in the philosophy department who is an expert on that particular critical thinking bit, collaborating with 4 different university faculty who have experience in biology. So some of them teach biology in high school. So we've got content experts, and we're going to look at this in university and middle school classrooms. Fact and critical thinking content. We're going to look at forgetting rate because from what we've seen, no one's actually looked at whether the rate of forgetting changes depending on the type of material you're learning, whether it's critical thinking material or fact material. And we're going to look at optimal ISI, so that all-important variable of when should you space things. We're going to look at optimal ISI for these different levels of material difficulty. And the study's actually getting started this year because I've got a teacher who is now a grad student in my lab, so we're going to be gung-ho into the, I think it's 5th grade classrooms this year doing this stuff. So I will keep you posted in about 2 years when we're done with data collection. That's how this stuff works. And we'll see what happens. But I think that it's a very exciting time for all this research because there's a lot of potential and there's a lot of room, despite the 100 and whatever years of spacing effect research, there's a lot of room to do new stuff and to do things that are really going to make a difference in the classroom. Take-home messages. Spacing does help, so use it. We've been using computerized homework assignments. I don't know if you or someone else has tested this, Catherine, but things like cumulative exams, do they really help? Because that's one of the recommendations we make is use cumulative instead of one-off exams, but we haven't actually tested this. Does breaking up curriculum units help? So that's another recommendation we've made, but we don't know yet whether that actually helps or not. When doing this kind of research, you need to develop collaborations with all the experts. We need to do more randomized controlled trials in actual classrooms with all the noise that's in the classrooms, because we've done so much lab-based research. It's time to get out there and see what things look like in the real world. And I thank the many people who have made this research happen and the lots of agencies that have funded our spacing research.
We have time for some questions from our audience.
Thank you, that was really great talk. For your future work, when you're looking at more material and forgetting rates, will you try to distinguish partial forgetting from complete forgetting? Because if the concepts are more complicated, then it's possible that I could remember this part but not that part, and whether or not that will be relevant to your future studies.
Absolutely, that's going to give us additional variance to make it easier to sort of hone in on how much forgetting is taking place. We definitely will do that.
It's perhaps unfair to pick up on the last point, but the idea of cumulative exams is fairly common in medical education. And here at McMaster, we've been running something called a progress test, which is highly cumulative. That is to say, it accumulates over the entire curriculum, over the entire years of medical school. And so all students in all classes sit the same exam 3 times a year, drawn from all of medicine. First time they sit it, they get 12%, the last time they get about 70%. Very useful for remediation, but also show an impact of that on the national licensing exam performance, accumulating over a long period of time.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
And we're one of, I don't know, maybe a couple of dozen schools in the world that are doing this kind of thing.
I actually had a question, Melody. With regards to work from that Catherine presented on multiple relearning trials, how does that interact with spacing?
Yeah, we did some work on expanding and contracting in fixed intervals, and it does look like contracting intervals, when you have a really long retention interval, contracting intervals look like they're the best. And we think what's happening is people are most focusing, in terms of how their brain is memorizing and retrieving material, people are most focusing on those learning sessions that have occurred just close to where, did I say that the wrong way? I said that the wrong way. Yeah, so contracting is really helpful for short retention intervals, and expanding is more helpful for longer retention intervals. Yeah. That work is published pretty recently.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll have one last question.
Hello, I'm sorry if I missed this, but I was just wondering, did you see that you said you worked with grade 5s, 5th graders and 8th graders? Was there much of a difference in age? Does age have any impact on the length of intervals?
I don't know the answer whether age impacts the optimal interval. That's one of the things that we will get out of this IES proposal if we get funded. We'll be testing both university and middle school, so we'll be able to start to answer that question. I can say that you can get a spacing effect in infants. So Rovi Collier has done work in infants. We've gotten spacing effects in preschoolers all the way up through older adults. Some work I've been doing with Patty Simone and Matt Bell at Santa Clara University. We've got spacing effects in people who are over the age of 70. So it goes across the entire lifespan, but I don't know whether the optimal ISI changes. And you might predict it would because of differences in